Welcome or welcome back to the Outernational podcast. I'm your host, Amrita Kadambi. I'm a musician, an activist, and an educator. And in this podcast, I highlight musicians and culture workers who are using their voices to resist in some way. And in this episode, I talk to the mighty Ian Lynch, who you might know from the band Lankum, which is one of my favorite bands. They are based in Dublin, Ireland, and he also has other projects, including a more experimental noise duo called One Leg, One Eye, who I'm curating on the Guess Who Festival, which is coming up next month. And the intro music you just heard was from Lankum's Glastonbury appearance in 2024. And I believe the story goes that they were cut from the live stream by BBC as they sang this version of The Rocks of Bon, is the traditional Irish song, and they sang The Rocks of Palestine, sort of a rewritten version of that traditional Irish tune. And this is very relevant to what we talk about in this episode because we get into censorship and cancellations, especially over the last 2 years, and just more generally and broadly, Irish anti-colonial solidarity. Being someone who is also from a nation that was colonized by the British, being from India, I found a lot of resonance in our conversation between sort of the Irish sentiment and the Indian sentiment, and of course the Palestinian struggle. There's so many intersections. So let's get into it. Here's my interview with Ian Lynch. I've known Lankum for a while. I actually had a voice student, Sasha Vine, who's in this band Weak Signal. I don't know if you know them, from Brooklyn, and she really wanted to sing for work on voice lessons with music from the British Isles. So we were doing "Black Is the Color of My True Love's Hair" because it's one of these wonderful folk songs that's been through every genre, every kind of interpretation and iteration. And then she brought me a Lankum song. She's like, can we work on this? And that's how I got to know the band back in 2020. And everything, the whole Lankum verse of all your projects and side projects and things are just really phenomenal. So I just want to say that up top. Yeah. For people who may be unfamiliar with your work, could you just say a little bit about your musical practice and where you're kind of coming from in terms of what you do as a musician?
We're talking personally speaking rather than Lankum. Yeah. I suppose it's heavily informed by Irish traditional music, and that's something I've been kind of deep into for the last 15 or 20 years. But also I do have a background in heavier, more extreme forms of music, from a very early teenage experience with just being in punk and DIY, hardcore, metal bands kind of throughout my whole youth. So I suppose that's something that plays, whether I like it or not, or for better or worse, it kind of continues to exert a big influence on my musical understanding or my musical reality or whatever you want to call it. So I suppose the two main kind of things I have going on at the moment are Lankum and One Leg, One Eye. The latter being probably a way for me to kind of externalize more heavier forms of music that I can't get out of my system with Lankum. So I think they kind of provide a nice contrast to each other, and they kind of just help me feel like a more balanced, sane person when I have the two of them. I'm not trying to get everything out with Lankum. I can be like, okay, I can save some other stuff back. I don't have to, it's not my sole focus. So I think they work together quite nicely. It's a simple
they're great.
kind of thing.
They're great. I mean, I hear those influences in Lankum, the noise and the more like broader experimental thing also like in moments, but it's cool to have that duo where it's really expansive, but you know, there's a through line, and that's the beauty of you get to do these things in different projects. So it was really great to see that project, and I'm psyched. We're going to be at a festival this fall at La Guess Who to see it again live. Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Like, I'm curious about. I think like I also really started out in the DIY. That was the route for my own kind of musical, the DIY and punk scene in the Bay Area, and then in New York. And since, you know, the idea of this podcast is really to kind of think about context, and so that includes for me like community, the social context, the political context, and right now, obviously, we're in such a insane global political moment. But one of the things for me that attracted me to DIY was this ethos of that was beyond just the musical aesthetics of you know, punk or whatever, but the kind of social ethos. And I'm kind of curious because I assume it's maybe similar in some ways in Ireland, but maybe different in others. Like, what was the ethos or the values of like the DIY and punk scene in Dublin when you were coming up as a youth? Like, and was that influential for you, or you know, I'm just curious what it was like over there in the scene.
Yeah, well, I think like so I was around 11 or 12 when a friend of mine gave me it was like a mixtape of this band, the Subhumans, kind of like you know, early 80s British anarcho-punk kind of stuff, and that was a massive gateway for me, you know. Like, that was going from the Subhumans and then through them finding like Crass and Conflict and Rudimentary Peni, all, you know, bands with like very like vocal, like political output, you know. We call them all very much like political punk bands, and so that was a really big part of it for me, you know. That's kind of what I found to be the most inspiring, was like the content of the lyrics and the social commentary and everything else, you know, and really like I suppose an introduction into like anarchist politics through all these bands and through reading the liner notes and the lyrics and everything else. And that was really like a gateway into like a much bigger world, you know. And so I suppose from then, I mean, I was still kind of too young to be going to gigs and stuff, you know, like at 12. But I think I was constantly like badgering my parents to be like, oh, I want to go to this gig and that gig, and they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, that's mental. You're only like 13 or whatever. But then when I was maybe like 15 or 16, I started going into like to shows. Like, you know, all the gigs would be in like kind of dingy bars and stuff, you know, in Dublin. Yeah. So I think like around 15 or 16 was when I started going into gigs. And I suppose, you know, my experience of the punk scene then, it would have been kind of maybe like different. I was probably coming into it with a far more like ideological kind of slant, just because of the style of punk that I'd been listening to. But then you go to the gigs and you're like, oh, this is actually like just, there's all kinds of head to balls from, you know, who are into this for all different kind of reasons, you know, and it's actually like a bit of a crazy kind of scene. But still, you know, even within that, just the whole like DIY ethos and the way that people were organising gigs and the way they were like just putting themselves out there and like just being active in like organising things and just creating a community, you know, that was something that was really like inspiring. And it's probably like this in like, you know, in the Bay Area and in New York when you were growing up, there's like a couple of different kind of punk scenes, you know. There was like the more like kind of chaos punk stuff, and that's kind of what I would have like found first and just been like, oh, this is kind of mad. And then there was the more like kind of more like hardcore, like you know, more kind of together people kind of scene as well, and the two of them used to clash. But I used to be like, you know, I'd go to gigs from like, you know, both scenes, and I'd kind of like make an effort to get along with everybody, but like it was just one of those things that it's like just from the very bottom and the very roots of it to the very top, to the very visible aspect, it was like very inspiring. Like, politics were at play, you know, whether it's like just the organisation and putting on gigs by yourself, or like organising other events like book fairs and zines and other kinds of get-togethers.
Were huge.
Massive, yeah. That was a big part of my teenage punk existence, and like, met so many friends through that as well that I'm still friends with today.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me it was something. It was impossible to separate that from the like actual politics that informed the scene.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was very much just all part and parcel of the one thing, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, definitely. I also had that experience of like ideological kind of mishmash. Like sometimes it would be like skinheads and like, really inconsistent politics if you got too like deep under the surface. But that
Yeah.
ethos, like especially in New York when I got here kind of in the mid 2000s, there was zine culture was huge, and it was always like very, very political, and the venues were like, these are all ages, these are live-in spaces, like, and there was even like a lot of community outreach, but then there would be these huge blind spots for like anti-racist politics as like super white scene and things like this. So there's always kind of that conflict, but just I think it's so important for so many musicians, the idea that people do have a point of view, and that music can be a gateway to opening up the way you look at the world, like your actual worldview. And it sounds like at least that much is true, especially in like the anarcho-punk culture. And I was reading about your kind of first maybe proper project with your brother Derek Lynched, and I think it said one, that you did change the name partly due to the connotation, so obviously you're already thinking about these things, but that you were calling them kind of like anti-authoritarian, like absurdist little
Yeah.
punks. Like how did you kind of get into starting that project, and what was motivating you there?
So yeah, the whole like that era of kind of our band, which was like I suppose about like 23 or 24 years ago now that we started, feels very different to what it's become now. But I suppose it was very much connected to my kind of like fledgling interest in Irish traditional music and traditional song and that side of things, which was something I think was very much connected to. So I had a dreadful time with like anything connected with Irish culture while I was in school, like the language, or even people like, mentioning like Irish traditional song around, and I'd be like, or Irish dance, and I just was like, this is all like, I want nothing to do with this at all. I'm a 14-year-old anarchist, and I don't believe in this nationalist shit. I had a very reactionary idea about it all, and to such an extent that like I purposely failed my Irish language exam when I was like 17, and like I'm so ashamed of it now, because when I was growing up as a kid, like, so my dad would have a very like anti-colonial way of looking at things, and he used to be always at me going, why, like, you need to learn the Irish language, when you're in school, it's very important to learn Irish. And I'd be like, oh, what's the point, nobody talks it, it's just a really old language. And he'd be saying, see, that's how much of a good job the Brits did on us, is they made us hate our own culture, and that's what you're repeating now. And so like he'd be telling me things this, or like he'd be showing me films like the film Zulu. It was made in 1964. It's all about like the British fighting, the Anglo-Zulu War, which was in the maybe 1890s or something. And he'd be showing me films like that, and he'd be like, see what's going on there, that's exactly what they did to the Irish, they did it all around the world. And so like I had this background of like anti-imperialism, anti-colonial politics, and I suppose it was when I finished, I just had a really gut reaction to all this stuff in school, even though I'd had this, I suppose this was my teenage reactionary years.
It's just the anti-authoritarian it's a big umbrella. Like, Dad is an authoritarian no matter how right he is. Your teachers are authoritarians, even if they're telling you things you should know. But I get.
And it's more like, I suppose it's the prerogative of every teenager. You have this reactionary stage, but what you're doing is finding your own way around to these things. So I had a very terrible time in school. Like, I got in a lot of trouble, and I got kicked out of schools and suspended. But like a lot of the teachers that I used to have problems with were like the Irish language teachers and the religion teachers, and quite often they were like the same teacher who would teach both those things, and they were like, for me, like the worst personalities. So I kind of left school with no knowledge of the Irish language, and then I think it was like only a couple of months after I actually like finished the exams, I was like going, hang on a second, and I started kind of seeing it in a different way, and I was going, going, oh no, I think I've been wrong all this time. I was like, what I really need to do, the actual like anarchist thing to do, is to learn the Irish language really well as like a, you know, like an anti-colonial action. You know, that's what I should have been doing. So I kind of went back then and I started doing like Irish language classes and trying to teach myself the language. And I went to college and I studied like early Irish, and kind of bound up in all this, I was getting more interested in the music and the song as well, you know. So I started to play the tin whistle. I started looking into playing the uilleann pipes, and I would have been learning traditional songs. So it was kind of around this time that me and my brother started playing as Lynched, and we started writing our own songs in a kind of like, it's a very kind of like naive way of looking at the music, but it was just like, I mean, it just sounds like we're playing bad punk, except, well, with a bit of David Bowie thrown in, a bit of glam rock in there as well, but like with an acoustic guitar, just like standard tuning and a tin whistle, and just like a lot of attitude and not too much musical skill. That's
but that's
what was going on there. So,
but like forming a voice or a point of view as a musician, it sounds like that was an important.
Yeah, it was a humble start.
yeah. I mean, it always is. I had my Takamine G series acoustic anti-war song. You know, that was like my first song I ever wrote, and I'm sure it was really bad. I don't remember, but it never saw the light of day. That was like, I was very clear about that. It's like no one will ever hear this, but yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because the relationship to language is just such a thing, and I feel like that in Ireland, I mean, in India, you know, the language is quite strong, but one of the things that is happening is the literacy has really gone down. Like, I speak my language, which is called Tamil, but I can't read or write it at all. And then I'm the older sister, and my sister, who's 8 years younger than me, can't really speak it, but she can understand it. And you could just see even in one family, like the relationship getting further and further away from the language, and because obviously it was the Brits, and India has 300 languages, but because English is so ubiquitous, like a lot of people, even in India, I mean, I think it will take a lot longer there for that relationship to get further away, but it's sort of, I get it kind of deep. It hits me deep that how important that relationship to language is, you know.
Yeah, no, really, especially like, you know, when people view their, like, you know, a foreign like language of the oppressor, they view that as like a symbol of progress and a symbol of getting ahead in the world, you know. So it's like, oh no, I'm not going to teach my kids this language. What's the point? You know, it's only going to hold them back. It's not important in today's world, you know. That kind of attitude, it's very hard to undo those associations, you know. Yeah,
it's I mean, alignment with power, alignment with capital, like all of these things, and I mean, that is the power of that, the dominant ideology, that it makes you feel inferior, and and that it's you're not going to get ahead in the colonizer or the capitalist world if you don't do XYZ. And so and I mean, I'm sure this translates to some extent to the music, to the traditional music, and I mean, it seems a bit like from the outside that there's kind of some kind of resurgence or something going on with Irish traditional and folk music. But I'm kind of curious, like, so you kind of got back into it maybe through this enlightening opening up of your worldview of realizing, oh yeah, Dad was right, maybe.
yeah.
But do you see folk kind of and Irish traditional music specifically as kind of inherently political? Like here, and in many parts of the world, not just in the U.S., like folk music, there's sort of an aesthetic idea of what folk music is. It's like acoustic guitars and a guy singing many verses of a song. But it also was always associated with politics here, Woody Guthrie and anti-fascist and labor music, but also like all over the world, in Italy, like all those anti-fascist songs. Like, is that a similar thing in Ireland, or do you see even just like the idea of Irish folk and traditional music as somehow inherently political? Like, how do you see that? Is it resistant music, I guess, in Ireland?
Yeah, it's interesting, because obviously there is a big kind of like body of material within the kind of the stream of tradition, or the stream of folk, or whatever you want to call it, that is, centered around the, songs of protest, worker songs. There's anti-war songs, and these were, you know, you can kind of see it a lot in the kind of the 60s like folk revival scenes, you know, whether that's in England or like Greenwich Village thing in the States,
Yeah.
or even in Ireland, you know. But like obviously in the world of traditional song, there's songs that are about like every single aspect of life, you know. Some of them might be just about how beautiful a group of mountains are, or
Yeah.
you know, just love songs or whatever. But like you kind of hit on there, I would kind of view, even like if you're dealing with any kind of these types of material in the tradition, the act of kind of interacting with that tradition and learning the songs and keeping them going is in some way an act of resistance in itself, you know, kind of no matter what specific material out of that you're taking from.
Yeah.
Just to, like, kind of the very act of like keeping this tradition alive and keeping this like distinctive voice and this distinctive culture in today's world is in itself an act of resistance against the homogenization that would seek to do away with all these like unique voices and unique ways of expressing ourselves in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Because sometimes folk tradition and traditional music can be very conservationist, and so it can feel like associated with a very conservative world of like, we don't want things to change, we don't want things to progress, or something like that. Like there is also that, you know, strain of it. But I think like this idea of like cultural memory and retention, especially when you're talking about a country that was colonized, you know, there's sort of pre-colonial and post-colonial, and trying to kind of retain that memory is so important, and the music seems like such a link to that past.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like it's quite ironic that this like act of conservatism is like resistance in
Right.
itself, you know, because it's in, you know, it's in the very like nature of a tradition. It has to be conservative about those elements in order to retain them, you know. And I suppose that opens up into a bigger question about the nature of like, you know, modern iterations of traditional music. How much of the tradition do you keep exactly how it is? How much innovation do you want to bring to it? And in the Irish situation, I kind of feel like, so obviously what we're doing with Lankum, or with One Leg One Eye, it is like presenting traditional material in different ways, you know, in ways that obviously have influences from contemporary styles of music that aren't there in the tradition. But I feel like there's enough people out there who are playing traditional music to very high standards, and they're doing it in a very traditional way. I'm like, that's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, great.
They're out there doing that. They're keeping it safe for the rest of us. They're keeping it in such a manner that in 100 years, hopefully people will still be playing it in very similar ways, and we can look at it and draw a true line and go, okay, that's how the tradition sounded. And even within Lankum, like I don't play so much in music sessions anymore. I did for a long time. These days I'm more likely just to be found in my room making weirdo music. That's kind of where I'm putting my focus at the moment.
Like trad sessions in pubs and things like that.
Yeah. Like I'd still go to trad sessions, and I haven't played pipes at a trad session for a while, but I'd still go. And if I sang at a session, I'd just sing a traditional song. I'd sing it straight up. I'm not trying to do anything with it. And even like the rest of the lads, they're going to trad sessions like a good few nights every week, and they're playing traditional tunes in a straight up traditional way, you know. So we're all like, you know, we're all doing our bit for the tradition. But when it comes to having a band who make arrangements of traditional songs, you know, obviously we're doing stuff that isn't in the tradition. And I think there's definitely room for that, you know. I think there's always been innovation within the tradition. If you look back at any era, like 100 years ago, people were coming into the Irish tradition with concertinas, and people were going like, what are you doing playing the concertina? You know, the Gaelic League people, they were like, that's not an Irish instrument.
That's
you know, you should only play Irish music on the fiddle or on the uilleann pipes. You know, concertinas aren't Irish. That's an English instrument. What are you doing? And then, you know, like a couple of decades later, it's part and parcel of the tradition. Everyone's playing it in sessions, you know. Or like the bouzouki that only came into Irish music in like the 70s, you know. That was, at that stage, that was like, oh, this is crazy. There's these hippies come and playing these, like, you know, Eastern European instruments.
Or
Greek,
European,
or, you know,
Greek,
but now it's just like you see it everywhere, you know. At one stage, no one was playing guitar in sessions. At one stage, people weren't playing accordions, you know, before they came from Italy.
Yeah.
So there are aspects of it that change, but like it's very slow. The actual core of the tradition is very slow to take on these changes. They might be happening around the edges, but to actually like get into the actual like bones of the tradition, I think it takes a while, because it is at its very heart, it's a conservative tradition, and I think that's what it's all about. It's about conserving this thing.
Yeah, I've even
years.
heard, like, I've seen Shruti Box, and like I went to some sessions in Dublin when I was in Ireland last June, and just there was like 3 pubs, just like rotating through the 3 pubs and just checking it out. And the musicians were all so open-minded. They wanted to like talk about all kinds of music, and they were playing very traditional, but they were like, oh yeah, I love the harmonium, and I was talking about how I play. And so and the folk festival was interesting. I was there at the time of the Dublin Folk Festival. I was there with my best friend who's Vietnamese, and she's a linguist, and her whole background is endangered languages. That she goes into communities, like she worked on a Musco in Mexico, which is an indigenous language, to like basically find the few core speakers of it, and develop like this method of reviving the language. And so we actually thought we would hear more Irish language, and we didn't. And she was kind of asking the musicians about that, and how many of them knew about that, and it seems though there is a bit of a maybe kneecap is like a big part of this, and other folks, where there are more young people now interested in the language. I wonder if that will like start to filter more and more into the music. Like, have you ever written in Irish language for Lankum or for other projects, or not?
I had a black metal project a number of years ago, and we wrote songs in the Irish language, and then for a film I was working on a soundtrack for a couple of years ago, we actually wrote like an early Irish song for that. So like the bits and pieces depending on the projects. Lankum, I think we've sang 1 or 2 songs Os Gaeilge over the years, but we've never kind of done a lot on it. Like I have a funny thing like with Irish language songs, because I've always felt like my like particular strand of the tradition that I'm kind of more like geared towards, or is like the kind of the tradition of singing in Dublin City, and obviously Dublin City has been a multilingual city like for probably 1,000 years, since it was founded by the Vikings. There have been like Scandinavian and like Anglo-Saxon, like French from the Normans, all different kinds of languages, but probably the Irish language hasn't been spoken here for quite a while, So I always feel like when I hear Irish language songs, I'll be like, oh no, that's the tradition of like Carna, or that's the tradition of like some other part of Connemara or Donegal. I don't really feel like I have kind of like ownership over that or something. I'm more like, oh no, that's their thing, But it's definitely something I'd like to get more into, but because I have so much time for the Sean-Nós tradition. I think it's absolutely amazing. Like hear a singer like Joe Heaney or someone like that from like the Carna Connemara Gaeltacht. Just really, I don't know, just it does things to my brain and my heart that like most other singing doesn't.
Yeah, I would love to if you can send me some of that. I'd love to hear.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure like some of this is sort of like some spiritual, ancestral vibey. Like I feel that when I hear certain things, I don't know why it's hitting me a certain way, that are from my own, from folk music in India and the ancestral traditions that I don't feel like I've ever had a connection with. There is something there. But I think, like, I was curious about sort of this, you touched on it a little bit, this like, sometimes there's this binary of like traditional versus experimental, and like what it means to innovate. But like you're saying, it's always been innovating. Like I kind of come a little bit from a more avant-garde jazz zone, and there are a lot of like traditionalists who are like, you have to start with the blues, and then there's like total genres. But I think that's important, actually. Like for me, that is really, like, blues was also like a resistant, anti-oppressive music that has this connection to like African cultural retention that wouldn't have, like it's transformed, but it was such one of the links, and so I'm like, I don't want to disrespect that. or like I use harmonium in my band, but it's not an Indian authentic thing that I'm doing at all. I'm using it like a synthesizer.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like interested in this binary because for me, I've kind of seen it in many ways, this idea of like traditional versus experimental. And one of the ways I've understood it is also that it is a bit of a colonial thing to say like, oh yeah, these people are traditional. It's like there's something also inherently a little bit like these people are backwards. They're not modern. Like they don't have
Yeah.
like a modern sensibility or something like this. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on that, like, and that relationship of those things for you, because they seem very connected and organic for you.
Yeah, well, like to be honest, I think you can really like tie yourself up in knots, you know, worrying about what is
Yeah.
like traditional and what isn't traditional, you know, and like and I've talked to other like, you know, like kind of died in the world traditional musicians about this over the years as well, and really like when it comes down to it, the only arbiter is taste, you know. The only arbiter is like, does this sound good or not? And if it
Totally.
sounds good, then do it, you know. It's not like you're not. I refuse to like ascribe to the idea that you're inherently like damaging something by creating music, you know. You're creating music because it means something to you and it makes you feel something. Maybe it makes other people feel something too, like, and I'm like, how can that be a damaging thing? You know, it's
Yeah.
almost like tied up with some kind of like Catholic guilt complex. It's like a shameful thing. You're like, oh, I did this thing and it was amazing, but now I feel really bad about it and I don't know if I should have done it or
It
not,
felt
you know.
good.
Like and it's like, of course Irish people feel that, like it's built into our psyche,
Yeah,
you know. You know, yeah, I just think that the key is to just don't worry about it. Just like do what sounds right to you. Don't worry if it's traditional or not. Don't be like, you know, kicking yourself, giving yourself like, you know, like burns on the wrist because you feel guilty about it or something. Just make the music that you want to make and let other people worry about what to call it or how high it scores on the traditional barometer or whatever, you know,
yeah.
like. Yeah, because like, you know, like you're talking about this idea that there's like, oh no, there's like the traditional people are, sorry, there's like the traditional people or traditional societies, and the idea that that's just something that's frozen in time and that's never
Exactly,
going
yeah.
to change, and it's been like that since forever, you know, like that's, I think that's
It's
a
a
totally
myth.
false idea. It's
Yeah.
a absolute myth, and I think there's no such thing as purity, you know, in that like way of thinking. It doesn't exist. I don't think it ever has. People making music, it has to make sense to them, you know.
Yeah.
If someone was to make music and they spend their whole time catering to somebody else's idea of what good music is, they're betraying themselves. You have to make what makes sense to your internal musical reality, you know. Otherwise,
Yeah.
what are you doing? You know, what's the point?
Yeah, your musical reality, and obviously the time and the place and the world that you live in, which obviously these things are constantly changing, and so the music has to change. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like for me, I had heard Irish music in the context here, in like Irish American, in really kind of cheesy sort of context, or like through like, okay, the Dropkick Murphys have a kind of Irish sound or whatever, you know. And it was for me like so eye-opening to go to Ireland for many reasons, to actually like see what Irish culture outside of the American context was, but also because of that sort of colonial solidarity, which I had inklings of. I sort of knew anti-colonial, let's say,
Oh
solidarity.
yeah.
Like which I had a sense of, but for me it was so eye-opening to be there. I felt very grounded. Like I travel in Europe all the time as a musician and have had extremely weird, fucked up experiences all over the EU. And I'm not saying that it probably doesn't exist in Ireland, but I was there for like 10 days and I had just such a different experience of walking around and talking to people. And some of the kinds of conversations that were coming up, like I went to Kilmainham jail, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
It looks like Gaol, but jail.
Yeah.
The which was a colonial British prison in Dublin, and then of course like after the rebellion it was also through the Civil War was a prison. And they were talking about, you know, the idea that like, they were imprisoning people for begging in the streets during the famine, which a lot of people corrected me and called it the starvation. And I was learning also about in India, there were 3 million or more Indians killed by famine that Churchill sort of like brushed off and was like, they breed like rabbits, like they're filthy or whatever, and when they had total control over it, like famine was really such a misnomer in that way. And I just was seeing so many parallels between like the partition of Ireland and the partition of India and Pakistan or the British mandate in Palestine. And how do you see the impacts of that in modern Ireland, and how, maybe there is this solidarity in Ireland that doesn't exist elsewhere on the European continent, I feel. But what kind of lasting impacts does that sort of colonial violence have now? I think there's like always this narrative from the colonizer to be like, that was then, now we're good, now we do business together, now Google is in Dublin and it's the most expensive city in the EU, which I did not know until I got there, people were telling me. But just like curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there's so many like aspects to this question. I think Irish people in general are like very aware and very cognizant of our history in the world. They're very cognizant of our history as like a nation that was colonized in the past and where we are now, and that's something that's there. But I think like on the kind of visible level, I think our like political leaders and people like that, they really like try hard to be like, oh, that was, like you were saying, that was in the past, we're all friends now, let's make some deals, let's not bring up that stuff. Oh, we don't mind anymore, it's okay, we're over it or whatever, but I think that does not represent how the vast majority of the people in this country feel. And I think that's nowhere is that more visible than in the last, like over the last 2 years, just the level of like solidarity with Palestine. Like every single place you go in this country, you see flags everywhere, flags and banners that people have made, like in every way in public life. It's very, very visible, and I think that's I kind of take it for granted a little bit when you're here, but then you go to other European countries and you're like, oh damn, this is so different,
and even here, I don't wear my keffiyeh if I'm alone, because it's scary. And like when I was in Ireland, I was like, all right, I'm wearing it everywhere. It's like it was a completely different situation.
Yeah, it's so different. Some Canadian friends of mine, Mama's Broke, were playing the other night, and I was at the gig and they were talking about it, and I was like, yeah, like, of course I travel a lot in Europe and to the States and everywhere else as well, and so I think we're very lucky here. And I find what that does for me is that when you're coming from a place where it's just so open and everyone's like, yeah, of course it's a genocide, why wouldn't you call it a genocide? Like, it's totally fucked up. They want to kill all the people and starve them so they can take the land. That's bottom line. Like, why would you even second guess that? That's literally that's what they're saying that they're doing. That's what they have been saying they're doing. That's what they're doing in front of our eyes. Why should we view it in any other way? But then you go to other countries and it's like it's from every level of society, it's like, maybe if the people would have had their own way of seeing it, the level of propaganda in the mainstream media in most European countries is to such a degree that like people, it's just really fucking weird, really weird, like telling you that this thing isn't happening, or that if it is happening then it's okay because of like this and that. It's just like, what the fuck, especially when you're going to yourself, like German language countries, whether it's Germany, Austria, maybe parts of Switzerland. I'm not really sure how Switzerland is, but it's just, it's a really mad time. But I think for me, that's where like, it really shows where the Irish psyche is at, because there is a level of identification with the Palestinian experience that you don't really see in any other European countries, because they all have histories of being the colonizer. They have histories of going to other countries, of like committing genocide so they can steal land and natural resources and bring it back, and that's where they got all their wealth over the years. That's where European wealth comes from. That's something that we we grow up with an understanding of that. Like I said, when I was a kid, some of the first conversations I remember having was my dad explaining all this to me, and that is not like, he's not like a radical in Irish society. He's just like a normal Irish person.
Yeah, and it's
that's
in
what
real.
we grow up with here.
It's also in real time, right? Because I mean, the extension of like the damage that was done through the British divide and rule tactic, which obviously they used in India, like the partition of India and Pakistan was so violent, and they are still. Like, I mean, Kashmir is occupied in a very similar way to Palestine. Like, India is the biggest weapons purchaser from Israel to occupy Kashmir. And, like, there is still, like, I wouldn't even call it tension. It's just all out. We almost had, like, a full war breakout, like, just a couple months ago. And I assume we're probably similar age. Like, maybe you're growing up in the 90s when your dad is talking about this. It's not like it was, like, even talking about a past like that, the conflict, no. The troubles was actively going on.
Yeah, no, I was growing up in the 80s, and I remember like literally every single night on the news it would be like, a bomb went off, 4 people were killed, or another bomb went off, or this thing happened, or someone was executed, like it was literally every single day on the news. And then I'd be going, what's going on, what's this all about? So obviously I'd have my dad explaining to me what's going on in Belfast and why the partition is there, and the I mean, there was a border there. The first time I went up to Belfast was for a punk festival in, there used to be a place called the Warzone Centre, which did gigs and had a cafe, like it's kind of like a radical DIY kind of community spot. I went up there and I think 97 or 98, and there was still soldiers on the border with like big machine guns, and like fucking British soldiers on the side of the road, like in Ireland. Do you know what I mean? It was crazy. I remember like the fella who was driving the van, he had a Michael Collins book on the dashboard, and someone was going, fucking take that off the dashboard. If they see that, they'll definitely pull you over. Yeah, it's crazy, and that's so like, that's 97. It's not that long ago.
The ceasefire, and I mean there are still British troops though, like I don't know, not as an occupying force, but there's still like vestiges of all of this even now. I believe I actually haven't been to the border. The closest I was in Dundalk, which is like really close, but I didn't end up going over. But I'm trying to go in March to Belfast. But it seems like it's really still present somehow, that relationship.
Oh, you can still feel it in the air. Yeah, you can still feel it in the air when you're there. It's like just kind of simmering under the surface. It's can be funny. I mean, I go up to Belfast quite a bit, and I really like it, but that you can just feel there's definitely something different. There's like a tension that's there, they don't feel in other places.
Yeah, and I know it's very complicated, kind of the idea of resistance, and sort of how the history is also sanitized as it moves into politics. Like I've been trying to read about sort of the transformation of like the politics of the IRA, how it's like, and how it had to sanitize to enter mainstream politics, and thinking about like anti-colonial resistance, and maybe a certain kind of identification with Palestine, of like this idea of like what it means to rebel and to push back. And of course there's a racialized kind of thing there of like who is considered like a rebel hero and who is considered like a terrorist, obviously. And in Ireland, I think you see both of those things. Like it's often called terrorism and it's often called resistance. And I've even heard from Irish people like the complicated relationship to it because of just maybe how close the bloodshed was in within even families of people being on kind of either sides of things. But it's, I don't know, it's just something that it seems so resonant with what's happening in Palestine. And when I saw you guys at Unsound festival in Poland, and I think wasn't that the 1 year anniversary weekend? It was like October 6th or 5th. Yeah, and I was like, kind of, I'll say this, and they'll hear it. I really pushing the festival to say something, because I played on October 6th, to say something about Palestine, and they had actually drafted a statement, and they were kind of like, oh, would you read this? And before I went on stage, and And then suddenly he was like, I just don't feel like I have the right words. I can't do it. And I think they like wanted to, but there was just that thing in the end that was just like, never mind, you know? And I think you were the only band that I remember. I wore a keffiyeh, and I actually was playing with a musician who, it was really complicated. It was a collaboration, and I was trying to navigate that. But I wore a keffiyeh.
Yeah.
Usually I say something on stage, but I had to sort of like I held it up, with my fist in the air at the end. And I felt people understand that symbol. But you had the Palestinian flag, and I think you performed Rocks of Palestine. And so, like, I know Lankum isn't necessarily like an overtly political band, quote unquote, although I think all music is political in one way or another. But how do you see what it means to you to speak out, not just in solidarity with Palestine, but also as the repression is increasing, like with these terrorism charges for kneecap? And what has it been like over the last 2 years, kind of expressing solidarity so openly as you've been touring? And how is that changing now? Like, it's just such an insane moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been mad. I think, to be honest, like, the whole experience has kind of like made us more like outspokenly political. Before that, like, I would say it's fair to say we probably have all what would be considered to be like radical political outlooks. But I've always kind of opted more in the favor of like Trojan horsing those like ideas in under the guise of like folk music, and kind of like getting them out to the world that kind of way, rather than kind of standing on stage and then like telling people what's what or whatever. And that's just the way we kind of had been over the years. But then that definitely it all changed. I think the first time we were on tour, over the years, it's not like we were against it or whatever. Like, we would play benefits. I remember even like 10 years ago, 2014 or 15, we were doing like benefits for Palestine and stuff, back then. And it was just after like October the 7th, and we were on tour. I think we had a load of gigs in Germany, of all places, like just a couple of weeks after that. I think the first gig we played was in Antwerp, and it was just, I suppose, there's the extremity of what was going on under everybody's noses, and the frustration that you feel that, like, it's like, why are people not out in the streets burning shit down? Why aren't people going crazy about this?
Every day I wonder why. It's still, I mean, it's getting worse and worse every day, and it's
So it was on that tour that we first started like speaking out, like, at all our gigs. We'd talk about what was happening, being like, lads, like, this is so fucked up, this is the worst. Like, what we thought then, that was the worst shit we were ever going to see. It was so unbelievably horrific and despicable. And I think the first gig we played on that tour was in Antwerp, and so we were kind of talking about it for a while and expressing solidarity with Palestine, and people were just like really weird and like quiet and stuff, And then after the gig, someone came up to us and they were like, oh, like, that was, I think it was good you said that, but some people were freaked out because like, there's a big Jewish community in Antwerp. And I was just kind of like so what? Like, the criticism still stands. Do you know what I mean?
And like,
the criticism of Israel still stands, no matter like where we are or what city we're in or who we're talking to. It's like, it doesn't change.
No, it's especially insane because there are Jewish people who oppose the genocide. Like, I had to explain to this German guy, and it was in Leipzig, which they were talking about having security just for our show, and they couldn't find a venue to host it. And finally, it was this kind of anarchist kind of theater that ended up, it wasn't even a music venue, so the sound was like kind of weird because we couldn't find the festival couldn't find a music venue to host it. And a guy coming up to me and saying, he was really uncomfortable with what I was saying on stage. And I was like, I organize in New York, and everyone I organize with is an anti-Zionist Jewish person in New York. Like, it's like, I mean, and Palestinians and all kinds of people, but they're like some of the loudest voices. So it's just always been a crazy thing. And to see Europeans like being like up in arms about, like, especially in Germany, where I think the Jewish population is very, very obviously very small.
Yeah.
And the Arab population is a much bigger segment of the population. Nobody breathes a word about Islamophobia, and then they are kind of out here. It's just so twisted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we had a really funny experience. So that was Antwerp was the first gig, and then I think we played a gig in Holland, and then we went to a place called Schorndorf in Germany, where everybody got like massively triggered because I said "Free Palestine" on the stage. They fucking freaked out. And all kind of like left the gig in silence, and then the organisers got really weird with us, and then after that we played in Leipzig where our gig was cancelled.
Yeah, that was a crazy place to be.
Yeah, like really, it was so mad, and you know, I had people writing me emails and stuff, and the same thing as you're saying, just a very limited understanding of like the German kind of. I mean, I'm not talking for all Germans, but it seems to be a common thing that they have this idea of Jewish people as being like this like historical unchanging victim, you know, and they have them kind of like they have some kind of character typecast in their head that they've never really met. They only know about from books, because I had somebody writing to me going, "Oh, that was mad that you said that, because don't you know that how much the Jews have suffered?" And I was like, yeah, of course I had. You know, of course I know about the fucking Holocaust. You're joking me. You think, well, I'm not aware of that? And they're like, yeah, but how could you say those things about Palestine? And, you know, do you not know that you know, this and that? And I was like, oh, look at, there's like fucking thousands and thousands of Jewish people in the world who, like you were saying, are anti-Zionist, and who really don't like to have the Holocaust weaponized to try and justify what's going on in Palestine right now. And they're just like, oh, we're like not aware of this line of thinking at all. It's kind of bizarre.
There's like one of these very, very long multi-syllable German words for the type of education that they get. I can't remember it now on this, but it is kind of in the education system from day one about, you know, protecting Israel, defending Israel is a responsibility for Germans, and tying those all together. But, you know, but it's not just Germany, right? Like, I think what's really scary right now, I work in a university here teaching. We've had firings like just last week for professors who were involved with encampments, and following the kneecap stuff right now of like having terrorism charges. And I think Glastonbury just happened, and Bob Villain went out and sort of like upped the ante, because I mean, like, how are you feeling as you see the consequences? It's like the more resistance there is, the more people are learning and speaking up. Like the especially Western quote unquote liberal governments are like really cracking down. Does it change anything for you? Like, how are you navigating this as things are just kind of increasing more and more?
I really feel like it's time to double down, because I think it's really backfiring on them. I think it's really backfiring for the British establishment at the moment. And I mean, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like textbook stuff, you know. If you go out and you criticize like the cool hip hop band for like what they say, of course kids are gonna come out. They're gonna go, oh,
nuts.
Kneecap. They're a crazy band called Kneecap from Bell. Cool, I'm gonna check this out. And then they look it up and they're like, oh yeah, well of course it makes sense. They're criticizing the genocide. You're trying to brush it under the carpet because you are like actively aiding, abetting, and financing it as we speak. You know, and you're like it just makes so much sense. And I think like, you know, that's kind of been one of the heartening things over the last like 2 years, that on some level that like the mainstream media is really like pushing this narrative, refusing to kind of like accurately document what's happening, but because of social media and just, you know, I suppose the way that young people kind of consume media, it's really like it's backfiring. Like the propaganda, Israeli propaganda, like the Western establishment propaganda, is really, really failing on this matter. You know, it's not having the intended effect. And I think that with the recent Kneecap stuff, it feels like they've kind of won the case already. You know what I mean? Like in a lot of ways. So I really think like now is the time to double down. I think the kind of the double standards and the hypocrisy of the Western establishment have never been more apparent. And I don't think we can stop now. We have to keep going, which, you know, it kind of like fucking sucks, because I I wish, and I know, like talking to the knee clap lads as well, they're like, you know, you kind of wish you didn't have to say these things, you know. It's like, oh, you know, I wish I could just play a gig and it was fun and we could have this like camaraderie with the audience, but instead you have to go, like, you know, we played this gig in Austria a month ago, and I was like, oh man, I know people are gonna fucking like freak out when they talk about Palestine, just because they have weird, even people that don't want to argue with you, they just get weird, you know. And it kind of like the buzz, you know, the last thing you kind of want when you're playing a gig is for like the buzz to go sour and the audience to turn on you. But you're like,
feels
we
still energetically have to do it, you know? So weird on stage when that happens. Yeah.
To feel that coldness, it's kind of like the opposite of what you're trying to achieve as a person on stage, you know. But it's like you just have to do it, and you're kind of gearing yourself up for it, and you're going, all right, how am I gonna phrase this or whatever, and you're like, well, you just have to fucking say it, like, you know. And it's kind of, it's what we've been doing, and we can't stop now, you know. You just have to keep going for whatever good it does. I think I've often asked myself this question, because it feels like no matter what you do, it's never enough, you know. Just the horrors that we see every day, like it's a fresh horrific scene every day that we're looking at going, what are we actually like doing anything here? But it's like, even if we're not like making any like concrete changes on the ground, it's just for other people to see that we're doing it and to see that it's okay to do it. Because there's almost, you get the vibe sometimes in European countries that like, oh, people are, oh look, they're trying to be really edgy, like by saying that you shouldn't kill fucking kids, like, do you know what I mean? That by saying that innocent children should be murdered is now the edgy thing, and somehow like the fucking, it's become mainstream to be like, oh no, it's okay to kill and starve innocent people. Like it's completely topsy-turvy. It's bends my brain thinking about it.
And it's like, it's getting worse. And there's this economist, Jason Hickel, that I've like really thought his analysis has been incredible recently, and he kind of talks about how it's like, well, why is the Western world so intent on like trying to maintain this narrative about Israel and that they're not colonizers, that they're not occupiers? It's kind of to me it feels like colonialism's last stand somehow, like in the most literal sense of what colonialism is, because we know obviously it takes many forms in terms of like keeping the global south in eternal debt and all these other ways that colonialism continues to operate, but that it's like the intensity of the violence feels like this is the last battle or something. And
it's like, if they lose this, then it's all over, you know.
And they know they're losing it. That's what's so crazy. But for me, what was so important about seeing you speak up is just like, I really am like, this should just be normal, and this should just be everyone.
100%.
And I just don't. It still feels like there's so many people are scared about the consequences and repercussions, and I just feel like, do you have a sense of like, it could happen. You could be hit with a terrorism charge. It's like, you know, I guess that's just part of the risk that you take, and it just feels like you got to take the risk. Like, what other option is there at this point? And I think the risk goes down the more people talk about it. So it's that collectivity, you know, is important.
It's a funny one, because it's been so many festivals I've been at over the last 2 years where I've been looking around and going, man, there are no visible kind of signs of Palestinian solidarity here. How are all these people out here having this like amazing time pretending, you know? It's like the scene that you see from the fucking music festival in Israel on October the 7th, you know, a lot of these people having an amazing time living here, when you're like, this is going on right beside you, you know. How could you be having such a great time? Do you not know what's happening in the world? Like, do you not know what's happening out there? And even in surprising ways, like we played in Roadburn last year, and as we did, like, we probably sang Rocks of Palestine and said something. I probably had a kafia on my table, and afterwards apparently they got all these like complaints about anti-Semitic remarks from Lankum. And I was going, who? And this is like it's like a heavy music festival, you know. You think people would be a bit more open-minded, but the amount of places that we've played, and literally we've been the only band, I'm pretty sure have been the only band to say anything about this. It's been kind of like staggering to me, you know. Really kind of has boggled my brain.
Yeah, and it's not, I think like one of the reasons why I feel like it's so crucial to be having these conversations is Palestine is sort of a symbol, I think, of global solidarity coalescing in a way against like the world order. You know, like there's a changing world order, and this is like there's this resistance to it. But it's obviously like in Palestine we see like climate kind of coming to a head. We see capitalism like with like the arms industry and the military industrial complex, like all these like just unbelievable, like Spotify being like Daniel Ek, like, and all these tech CEOs just being so blatantly overtly invested in AI like surveillance and weapons technologies. And for me, it's like seeing how interconnected. Like one thing I even noticed when I was in Ireland, and I have some friends who I met there who are kind of activists working against like this anti-immigrant kind of sentiment that they're trying. A lot of the politicians, like I saw some stickers saying Ireland is full. And
there's a good bit of that kind of stuff these days.
I thought I knew what that meant. I asked someone, I was like, yeah, it's like, Dublin, I was told is one of the most expensive cities in the EU, and I was truly blown away by that. And they were telling me about the tech companies. Do you see like some kind of rhetorical resonance between what might be they're trying to do in Ireland, some of the politics of that with like the United States, and obviously the UK had those riots early, or I guess that was last year also.
Last year,
yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a funny one in Ireland. Like, there's been a housing crisis here that's been going on for a long time. It's been a long time in the making, like going back to probably like 2008, when we bailed out the banks, and normal people they had to like pay the brunt of that through austerity and cuts and all the rest of it. So like years and years of mismanagement of the housing crisis, just not enough homes being built, like huge like housing estates just being sold off to like Canadian companies, like really, really bad things happening on the housing front. And then in like the last couple of years, people coming out and going, oh yeah, it's because of like these immigrants that have been arriving in the last couple of years. That really, like, it's not, I don't know how people can buy that, and then you have like politicians from the mainstream political parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, being like, I think it is the immigrants. It's like,
because they don't have to do anything. Then they don't have to do shit. They don't have to actually come up.
They haven't done anything about this for a long time, and I would say they've actively like almost like engineered this housing crisis. Like, so many of them are landlords themselves. They're unwilling to put proper like regulations in place to stop how landlords are just gouging people,
But that sounds exactly like New York. I mean, it sounds exactly like London. It sounds like so many places.
It is happening everywhere.
Yeah, and it's that same rhetoric. And like, I think one thing, I mean, that I'm interested in and that we can be doing is to sort of like be sharing the knowledge about how these systems work across these borders, because it's not really about nation states anymore, right? It's like, it's really just these massive corporate interests and billionaires that sort of like are porously working across like all different nations towards their aims to consolidate power and wealth.
Well, that's the thing. I think if these like powers are acting on such a global level, then the resistance against that by necessity has to be on a global level. We can't afford to like be like isolating ourselves, being like, oh no, it's only for Irish people over here and only for English people over there. Like, literally, resistance has to be as global as the kind of the powers that are destroying this world.
Yeah, exactly. I guess like to bring it all home, so to speak, like in terms of being a musician, obviously, like it feels kind of small, like these gestures of solidarity, or maybe just trying to make these connections between musicians. Like, what do you see, whether it's in Lankum or on your own, like your role in all of this right now? Because I mean, I know you're also a scholar of folk and political music. I listened to your podcast, Fire Draw Near, and I love like your analysis of political songs in particular. Like, we know that there's been a historical role for music. So I know, like, as musicians, maybe we're all a bit self-effacing, so we feel like, well, what does it do? But also we have this historical understanding of like, it does something. How do you see your role right now? Like, are you thinking about this consciously, or like what should we be doing? What are you doing? What are you trying to do? What do you want to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like it's easy to beat ourselves up in this environment, because I like, personally speaking, I constantly feel like I'm just not doing enough and there should be more that I'm doing, and it's like, oh, like I can't really like organize with people at home. I should be doing more like actions and stuff here in Dublin, but then I'm off on tour all the time. So I kind of vacillate between being like, oh well, my role is like, I'm on stage with this band, I need to talk about this thing, I need to raise consciousness and raise awareness of what's going on now in Palestine. But there's so many things out there, that we need to be talking about. And like I was saying, my kind of before, like pre October the 7th, I suppose I would have been like, well, these ideas are here in my politics, and I'm gonna get them through in the music in subtle ways, But now I'm kind of like, maybe the time for being subtle is gone.
Yeah.
It's behind us. The times have changed.
Yeah.
So I really don't know. I suppose to just get out there and inspire others to action, inspire others to do what they can, because we all have our own part to play. We all have our own roles. We all have our own specialities and our own skills, to bring to this struggle. I suppose it's up to us personally to figure out what exactly that is, and then do what we can, because there's no future on this planet unless we fight for one. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and that's just that, I want to be as idealistic as the anarcho-punk 15-year-old that I once was, right? Of like maintaining that kind of that idea, and that music is actually can be really powerful in a way that it can expand people's consciousness, because I know that for you or for I, like, it did that, like it was one of those big gateways of understanding the world. And I think like maintaining that as much as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And like you say, like special skills, like we have a very special set of skills. Like, yes, there need to be bodies out there, and there are. And like, I'm like looking at PAL Action and so many of the actionists and organizers around the world. And it's like, their touring is that's a huge conflict for me too. I feel so shitty sometimes when I'm on the road and seeing like people getting arrested in New York, like blocking a bridge or something. Like, I don't want to be there, but I do think we all have different roles. It's like, how do we leverage like whatever influence or whatever power, and there are like someone like Sinead O'Connor for me was so like inspiring, or Nina Simone is another big one for me, of like, but they really suffered for what they did, and I feel like we have it easy, like we have it a little easy,
Yeah, big time. I know, when you look at what Sinead O'Connor went through, Jesus.
Yeah. We can all be doing more, but I think music is a really powerful place to be doing the work. So I really thank you and everything that you've been doing with Lankum. Like I really felt like alone in some ways, and seeing you guys at Unsound was really important for me. And seeing you in New York, same thing. And like that, I was happy to hear the New York crowd had no problems. Like they were there because they were in 100%. Solidarity with you and just love the music. So yeah, I'm just like looking forward to doing the same this November at Guess Who. I mean, God, hopefully like we're in a different place by then, but it feels insane. But yeah, and I do encourage anyone who's interested in this kind of conversation also to check out your podcast, Fire Draw Near, because it's not, I know it's about folk music at large, but so much of that political intersection I think is, for me, fascinating. Like, I love this kind of conversation. So yeah, thanks for doing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on, and I'm sending you much solidarity and love from Dublin.
Yeah, same here from
also
New York.
Looking forward to Guess Who. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll see you then. Thanks so much, Ian.
Okay. Thanks,
right.
Martha.
Well, that was my conversation with the very brilliant and very thoughtful Ian Lynch. If you enjoyed this conversation, you want to hear more like it, please, please, please subscribe and follow on Substack at Amrita Kadambi under the tab Outernational. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. And most importantly, tell your friends or tell your enemies or tell anyone you think would be interested in these conversations. I'm doing this because I really believe that at this absolutely kind of insane and scary and unfathomable time, these are the conversations we need to be having with each other, learning from each other, and it's all I know to do right now. Outernational is produced by Z Park. It is recorded at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, and it's engineered by me. And as we always do, closing out this podcast, I'm going to play you out with a track by the artist that you just heard talk for about an hour. This is Ian's experimental noise project, which is called One Leg, One Eye. And this song called I'd Rather Be Tending My Sheep is from the album And Take the Black Worm With Me. Until next time, solidarity.
If I was the king of Taunton Town, I'd wear a sword and a big golden crown. I'd ride on the fore as we marched off to war, with soldiers to follow, 100 or more. But I'd rather be tending my sheep. Yes, I'd rather be tending my sheep. My ewes and my rams and my little young lamb. Yes, I'd rather she